Washington Journal continues.
And we're going to continue our conversation about the new super committee that's been created, the debt ceiling legislation passed earlier this week. We are joined first by John Wonderlich of the Sunlight Foundation. He is their policy director. Also at the table is Paul Krawczak of Congressional Quarterly, a staff writer. Mr. Krawczak, have you heard any indications yet about who the 12 members may or may not be?
I have not heard. They have until the 16th of this month to make the 12 appointments, and so far the four leaders have not given any indication of when they will make those appointments or who. In the halls of the Capitol, are you hearing reports about people lobbying for themselves, for their friends, etc.? Not right now, because everybody basically has left. The House is gone and most of the Senate is gone. So there hasn't been too much going on in the Capitol right now. Mr. Wunderlich, has there ever been a committee formed like this before with this jurisdiction, with this real power?
I don't know that there's been any committee with this exact formation, but as we've looked at the amount of power and responsibility given to these 12 members of Congress and the fact that they have a direct route to the floor of the House and the Congress, we've really focused on the fact that they need to be transparent and accountable in what they decide and how they do it.
What do you mean by that?
So this committee that's been created by the new law, there are very few requirements for how they function and whether or not their meetings are going to be public and whether we know who's going to be lobbying them and what bills they're drafting and what their work actually looks like. So the Sunlight Foundation is launching a campaign to try to demand that this new super Congress or super committee operate in the public view on the Internet.
Well, now, Senator Coburn has stressed, when he met with the Gang of Six especially, that it was much better to have private meetings because people aren't themselves when the cameras are on.
Right, and we wouldn't say that there can't be any private meetings, but we would say that if this committee is going to have an official function and meet as a committee and propose legislation, that at least should be visible to the public. And what we've seen so far throughout these debt negotiations, starting even in December with the tax cut extension and then with each step in the budget battle, has been a discussion that is almost completely secret, and then when a complex set of proposals comes to light, we have maybe 14 hours in the case of this latest bill for members of Congress and the public to try to understand what's been proposed, and that's just not enough time.
Paul Krawczak, we are hearing from a lot of people, a lot of our viewers, and you're hearing from commentators as well about the constitutionality of this committee. In your view, is it constitutional?
I would say yes. I mean, I don't see any reason at this point that suggests that it's not. But, of course, the devil's in the details, and so we'll see what specific objections are raised.
Well, joining us now is a law professor from American University, Jamie Raskin, who does not find it constitutional. Is that a correct statement, Mr. Raskin?
No, actually, essentially the way that the committee has been formed looks constitutional. It looks the way that other committees and subcommittees have been formed in Congress, and it preserves for each individual body, the House and the Senate, the right to vote on final passage of legislation, which is what the Constitution requires, so that the committee itself can't do anything without action by the House or the Senate. Now, of course, the House and the Senate are straitjacketed to a certain extent because they essentially have to vote up or down on everything that the Special Joint Committee does without amendments and without delays. I think the constitutional questions that have been raised are not so much about the structure or the composition of the committee, which does resemble other, joint committees that have been fashioned in the past, but rather some of the other requirements about the activation of different proposals that take place. For example, the balanced budget constitutional amendment, which has to be considered at a certain point, and whether, in fact, Congress can bind a future Congress to vote on a constitutional amendment, and whether, you can make passage of future legislation, which is done by a majority vote, contingent on passage of a constitutional amendment, which, of course, requires a two-thirds vote. I mean, that's where the constitutional questions have been raised, and I think some of the more interesting questions are. But the fact that the committee's got a lot of power and that it's, going to be referring legislation for an up or down vote in each house. I think all of that does pass constitutional muster.
Mr. Raskin, what does this do, in your view, to the committee system already in place in the Congress?
Well, I think in a political sense, it obviously establishes a precedent that when there's a very difficult set of questions where it's tough for a political consensus to be formed and for Congress to bite the bullet, to establish one of these super committees to make some very hard, unpalatable choices, and then to send it quickly on a fast-track basis to the full Senate and the full House for an up or down vote. And again, that is a similar kind of self-disciplining mechanism that both chambers have used before in dealing with very hot issues.
So overall, when you look at this structure that's been put in place, how concerned are you about the process?
Well, in a political sense, I think there are some real questions about everything that's taken place. In that, there hasn't been, a full ventilation of opinion and dialogue and discussion within Congress. And, there seems to be a kind of a self-imposition of a set of procedures that cuts off a complete dialogue and a complete debate. But also, look, the magic of a democratic system is everybody gets to speak and everybody gets to participate, but then also people get frustrated because things take so long, and then there's constant back and forth, and there's appears to be stalemate and paralysis, and that moves the legislators to create procedures like this, and then that creates a counter-frustration of cutting off debate and appearing to limit the dialogue that people want in democracy. And so that's just, a constant dynamic within American political democracy where we sort of swing back and forth in either direction. And so, in a substantive sense, I can find a lot of problems in the deal that was created. And, I think that the deal that came out, has some oddities that appear to be in tension with different constitutional principles. But I don't think there's anything in here that's likely to be struck down by the Supreme Court.
Jamie Raskin is a constitutional law professor at American University. Mr. Wonderlich of the Sunlight Foundation, you were nodding your head a little bit as he was talking. What caught your attention?
Well, the one thing I find interesting is the question of whether or not a current Congress can bind a future Congress. And so we do a lot of looking at the rules of the House. We actually proposed maybe 70 changes to the House rules, and when Speaker Boehner took over, they adopted 12 or so of the specific changes to make committees more open or to make ethics filings more transparent. And so as someone that pays a lot of attention to the rules of the House, I find it interesting that proposals like this would suggest that the House in the future needs to follow what the House of the present did and the law that they passed, trying to bind the hands of the future Congress, because it's a very difficult thing to propose. So when we're considering how this is going to play out, we need to remember that any future Congress or the House or the Senate could just change its mind.
Mr. Krawczyk, are you hearing frustrations in the House or in the Congress about this committee and its super jurisdictional powers?
Yes, there's quite a bit of opposition to it, criticism of it. Senator Jeff Sessions, who's the ranking Republican on the Senate Budget Committee, has been particularly critical of the committee. He said that the way Congress should work is that committees debate these issues over a period of time, and there's an amendment process, and you eventually come up with legislation. In this case, you have this super committee that has the authority to come up with a plan which goes to the House and Senate, and no amendments are allowed. So there's quite a bit of concern that this committee has too much power and will be doing what the whole Congress should be doing.
Yes, yesterday's New York Times called it an untransparent, undemocratic huddle, which I thought was a concise turn of phrase.
The headline of that their editorial was "Hiding Behind the Budget Act." What's the president's role in this committee, if any?
The president doesn't really have a role in this committee except that he was part of negotiating the guidelines for this committee. But he doesn't really have a role except, I mean, he certainly will have an influence on the committee's deliberations because he's the president and through the vice president, but he does not appoint anybody to this committee. It's strictly 6 House members, 6 Senate members.
And technically, as a member of the Senate, as president of the Senate, could Vice President Biden be appointed to this committee?
No. I mean, technically, perhaps, but it won't happen.
It won't happen. Why?
Because he's the vice president. Because he's not a senator. I mean, it's hard to see that that either the Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid or Mitch McConnell, the Minority Leader, would appoint the vice president. But it's always possible, but I think very doubtful.
John Wonderlich, when it comes to the appropriations process that we go through annually or sometimes go through annually, and the budget process, those are pretty wide open. Would the Sunlight Foundation agree with that or not?
Not entirely. I mean, the Appropriations Committee committees tend to score the very lowest as far as announcing their schedule or webcasting their meetings or even just all forms of accountability. Even to find the bill that they voted on has often taken us, even with phone calls and pursuing it, we have to go to the Capitol and find the room and say, could you please give us a copy of the bill that you just voted on? So that's not very transparent in the year 2011, maybe in 1940.
So if this super committee opens up its deliberations to cameras, to C-SPAN cameras, and does some of the things that the Sunlight Foundation has argued for, including posting online, contributions, etc., does that improve the process that's currently in place?
Well, it certainly legitimizes it, and it makes a lot of very unsavory things much less likely. One of the biggest things that we're calling for is for all lobbying contacts between members of the committee or staff of the committee and any lobbyist or other powerful interest meeting with them to be posted online immediately. And that sounds like an aggressive thing to ask for, but if you look at the example set by the Obama administration, as they've implemented the stimulus and the TARP program and the Dodd-Frank bill, each of those programs has come with a self-imposed lobbying disclosure policy. And you can see online where they're posting the records and information about every meeting they have with lobbyists. And we think Congress should do the same thing generally, but especially now when these 12 members have been given so much power.
Mr. Krawczak, is there any doubt that the Paul Ryans and the Kent Conrads of the world will not be appointed to this committee?
I think it's an open question. I think they could be.
Because I mean, with their positions on the budget committees in the Senate and the House, but is there a chance that they might not be?
There's certainly a chance that they might not be. I mean, I think it's unclear who's going to be appointed, but it could be budget experts like Ryan or Conrad. It could be Eric Cantor in the House, for example, the number 2 leader in the House.
As somebody who covers Capitol Hill, what does this system do to the current budget-making process in place on Capitol Hill?
Well, one of the main things it does is a budget resolution is required each year. The Senate comes up with one, the House comes up with one, and ideally they compromise and they agree on a single budget resolution. This deems the next two budget resolutions, the 2012 and the 2013 budget resolutions, are deemed by this. So the House and the Senate don't have to pass a budget resolution in 2012 or 2013. They may anyway, but they don't have to because this sets the discretionary spending cap for those 2 years and it provides the procedural safeguards for a budget resolution.
Our guests, Paul Krawczak of Congressional Quarterly and John Wonderlich of the Sunlight Foundation. We are continuing our talk about the Super Committee and its role in the budget-making process. 202 is the area code, 624-1115 for Republicans, 624-11 11 for Democrats and 624-0760 for all others. You can also send us a tweet, twitter.com/CSPANWJ, or send an email, journal@cspan.org. First call up for our guest comes from Toledo, Ohio. Go ahead, Nola.
I'm calling because I think Congress should be able to do their job. Why do they have committees about everything? Why do they need other committees to just confuse the situation and make it even worse or harder to do their jobs?
Mr. Krozak.
That's a good point. I think the reason this committee will be formed, I think it is really an instance of kicking the can down the road. They were not able to, Congress was not able to agree on enough deficit reduction, and so they are putting it off. They're putting it in the hands of a committee, and it's because they were not able to come to agreement.
Newport, Tennessee. Hi, Rob, on our independent line.
Oh, well, thank you for C-SPAN. And I agree with Nola. And also, I think the key to this is going to be the composition of the committee. And if they put just a bunch of establishment politicians on the committee, they'll just kick the can down the road like they always do, and nothing really is going to happen. Especially the Republicans. The Republicans have got to put some of these new people in that change the dialogue from just up in the debt ceiling and going on as we've been going on to actually talking about some reductions. That's key, I think.
Mr. Wonderlich, any response for that caller?
So it's hard to imagine what leadership's incentives are going to look like as they decide who to appoint to the panel. And so we're looking closely, and I think, like everyone else, wondering whether Paul Ryan's going to be there or not, and what the makeup is going to look like. They could choose more prominent or less prominent members. We're just hoping they'll choose people that are going to be open about what they're doing.
Our next call for our two guests as we continue our discussion about the super committee. Crescent City, Florida. Sue, Republican line. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for taking my call. I had two quick points. One, I don't believe this committee is constitutional, and the reason is the voters put the House in a majority where that's where the bills are created in order to balance out this government. And I think we have given up this balance by making this committee equal. And my second point is, I believe our government was formed to operate from the middle. And when the administration, and in my opinion the Senate, leaned so far left, I believe that was why the Tea Party had to come into existence to balance the government again. And perhaps it's not supposed to get much done or little done unless this government moves to the middle again. Thank you for my call.
John Wonderlich.
I'd say the House has tied its hands and said that we will vote on whatever comes out of the committee. And so if the House chose to, the House could also untie its hands and say we're going to ignore the committee. That's unlikely, but it was the House's choice to bind itself to this.
Paul Krozak, the base closing commissions, you've covered Capitol Hill for quite a while. Is this similar to the base closing commissions?
It's similar and also different. The base closing commission has a procedure whereby they make a recommendation and Congress can vote it down but can't change it. This is somewhat similar in that this committee will come up with a deficit reduction bill and Congress will not be able to amend it, will be able to approve it or not approve it. So it's similar in that sense. And if I could just add one other point, in connection with this committee, although in a sense it is kicking the can down the road, there is an enforcement mechanism here. If the committee doesn't come up with a deficit reduction plan, or if it comes up with one but Congress does not pass it, then there will be automatic across-the-board spending cuts throughout both defense and domestic spending, equaling $1.2 trillion. So there's great incentive for this committee to come up with a package and for Congress to pass it.
And are there any limitations on what this committee could consider? Could they come back and say, okay, we're going to change the tax code to a VAT?
There are not limitations. I mean, they could propose an overhaul of the tax system. It's hard to believe that they have enough time to do that. Something like that typically takes at least a year to put that together. But they can propose cuts to entitlement programs, defense spending, discretionary spending. They could close tax credits and deductions. They could possibly even do a tax overhaul. So no limitations.
John Wonderlich, this tweet has come in from IRE 2008. This super commission is just another example of the erosion of our democracy. 12 individuals will decide the future of the country.
I'd say we've been frustrated watching all throughout. It's like 1995 every 3 months in Washington for the last year or so, where we have a game of chicken rapidly approaching some dire consequences, whether it's the government shutting down or defaulting on our debts. And it has been really frustrating that the way our leadership confronts those things is to exclude the public from the debate. And this applies to the Senate leadership, to the House leadership, and the President. All three of them have basically said the appropriate response is to recede and negotiate privately. And I think that's what we're going to continue to get unless we stand up and say that we expect more from our leaders.
What is the Sunlight Foundation?
So the Sunlight Foundation is a nonprofit dedicated to creating a more transparent and accountable government, especially through new technology and the Internet.
Dayton, Ohio. Kate, Democrat. Good morning.
Yeah. Hey, I mean, clearly, the American public has great ideas. You can hear them all morning here on C-SPAN. But and then also clearly, our reps aren't listening to us. Wasn't it something like 70% of the American public say raise taxes on the wealthy? Now, where they draw that line is, of course, of question. And then to close tax loopholes. And so clearly they're not listening to the American public. And as Mr. Wonderlich keeps pointing out, and thank you so much for the Sunlight Foundation, if people call our reps right now or call these members of the committee, can we demand that we have access, like you said, to the lobbyists that they're meeting with, so we find out exactly what's going on? And again, you can listen all morning to C-SPAN. American public has great ideas, but they're not listening to us. They're listening to the lobbyists. Otherwise, there would have been tax increases, or will be tax increases, raising of revenue. Thank you.
Thank you for your call. Mr. Krozak, any comment for her?
Transparency is a great thing. You had mentioned that Senator Coburn had concerns about a public forum, at least as far as the Gang of Six goes and Fiscal Commission goes. The advantage of having meetings out in the open is that the public can see everything that's being discussed, and that can be an educational process in itself. I mean, as issues come up, that gives that provides an opportunity for the public to become aware of the different arguments and the different issues, and so that could provide a public service as well.
And in fact, here is Senator Coburn. He was on this program on March 2nd, 2011, talking about the Gang of Six.
You can't negotiate these things in the press, and it's difficult to take somebody like Dick Durbin and Tom Coburn, who are at the ends of both spectrum, and negotiate and make hard decisions and hard compromises if you're doing it in public life, because anybody that is against what you're doing is going to be critical of it. And we don't know what, we're not there yet, so any comment on what we're doing or how we're doing it is inappropriate, and also handicaps the ability to try to come to something that will really help our country.
John Wonderlich.
So I think it's okay for something like the Gang of Six to try to meet in private and come up with a proposal that everyone else might agree with. That's the Senate being deliberative. I think that's appropriate. But when we have 12 members of Congress that have a direct route to the floor of both chambers, and when whatever they decide has to be voted on, or else we're going to have across-the-board budget cuts, I think that's a different standard. And I think that we need openness. Even if it makes politicians uncomfortable, it doesn't matter. It's their responsibility. So it's something that we need to demand.
Stephen, a Republican in St. Petersburg Beach, Florida. Hi, Stephen. You're on the air.
Hello. Good morning, gentlemen. I was just thinking, this is just a power grab in a sense. If they really wanted to make reform on a budget, why can't they just take 3% from Social Security, 3% from the military, 3% from all federal employees, 3% from all state employees, make the cut across the board? Nobody gets hurt. Nobody gets crushed. We're fiscally responsible, and we can pay a lot of our national debt and resolve a lot of problems across the future. It won't fix everything, but it's a great start. Thanks, gentlemen. Good morning.
Mr. Krozak.
That's certainly a valid approach. It's not the one that Congress has taken in this case. Congress has chosen to sort of zero in on specific areas where it thinks that cutting can most effectively be done, rather than sort of an across-the-board haircut. But that would make things easier, but it hasn't really been seriously considered in the past in this debate.
Michael Johnson tweets in, a few days ago a caller recommended that Dems appoint Republicans and Republicans appoint the Dems. What do your guests think? Mr. Krozak?
Well, that would be very interesting.
Would it be a first?
It would be a first. It would be a first.
It's growing up, I was told, if there's two people, you cut, the other person chooses. So that would be quite an approach. I hadn't thought about it before.
Whose idea was it to create the super committee?
It originally came from Harry Reid, and this was during negotiations between congressional leaders and the president. And actually, it started with Mitch McConnell came up with a sort of a fallback plan for raising the debt ceiling if congressional leaders couldn't reach agreement. And then he started working with Harry Reid on that, and Reid came up with the idea of a committee, and that committee evolved, that idea evolved into what we have in this legislation.
Harry Reid spoke on Saturday about the super committee. Here's what he had to say.
The 12-member commission I conceived to recommend additional deficit reduction measures this year will be a key to that effort. And I say to my friend, the Republican leader, I appreciate his wrapping his arms around this and being such a cheerleader for this idea. It's a good idea. It's an idea that Congress itself would solve the problem. There would be a joint committee that would move forward, and there would be a trigger that if they didn't resolve this, then something else would happen. And based on past experiences, I think there would be tremendous incentive not to let that certain thing happen when the trigger kicked in.
John Wonderlich, in your view, is this any way an abdication of Congress's responsibility to create a budget?
Well, I see it as an institution trying desperately to take something seriously. It's like if you try to go on a diet and say, I will stick to the diet, and if I don't stick to the diet, then I'm only going to eat broccoli for a week. But the thing is, there's nothing that forces you to follow the trigger when it goes off, too. So it's Congress saying we're really going to take it seriously. And like so much of the rest of the budget process, there's so much smoke and mirrors involved, where it's one layer after another of trying to spread out political credit and make a process that smooths things out and often has the opposite effect.
Mr. Krozak, how is this committee going to be staffed?
The committee will hire staff. It'll have two co-chairmen appointed by the committee, actually, I think one is appointed by John Boehner, the House Speaker, and the other one by Harry Reid.
Correct.
But it'll hire its staff and pay its staff, and that's laid out in the law. And it's not clear how many staff members it will have. That will be figured out.
Very quickly here again, 12 members, 6 appointed by House leadership, 6 appointed by Senate leadership, and that needs to be done by August 16th. The co-chairs are picked by Representative Boehner and Senator Reid. Committee has until November 23rd to work out its recommendations and craft legislation. Congress has to act on the recommendations by December 23rd, and by the way, there can be input up and through October 14th by other committees. Other congressional committees can recommend input. to this super committee. Buford, Georgia, Brenda, Democrat. Hi, Brenda.
Hi. I just wanted to say that I don't believe that the subcommittee will agree to anything because Congress is just broken. And it's very discouraging to see how our representatives in Congress do not want to meet each other halfway and compromise. We as Americans deserve so much more than we're receiving from Congress right now. And I just wanted to say, people, wake up. We cannot elect Republicans. We are going down as a country just because they don't like President Obama. And all of us are suffering behind that. Thank you.
Mr. Wonderlich, any comments for her?
I agree that we deserve more. It used to be that congressional committees were too strong in this country, and it's kind of amazing as you walk through how this would work to reflect that the congressional committees are reduced to providing advice to a group of 12 members of Congress that are going to decide the direction of the country. And it's unfortunate that we've ended up in this place.
Speaker Boehner also talked about the super committee.
Senator McConnell and I have talked about our appointees to this committee. We've not made any decisions, but I'm sure that we'll continue to have conversations about our appointees to the committee.
Michelle in Oklahoma City, you are on the air.
Good morning. I think that as long as the super committee is working, the rest of Congress should be furloughed, laid off. They shouldn't be called back to Congress until they've reached their determination and have an up or down vote. Their salary should be taken then and applied toward the national debt. If they can't work together and they're going to rely on the super committee, we shouldn't pay them.
Paul Krozak.
Well, they have a lot to do besides work on the budget. So I think they'll be back in September and they'll be busy. I mean, this bill did represent Republicans and Democrats from both chambers coming together, and they've put together this deficit reduction plan and this committee, and the goal is to cut more than $2 trillion from the deficit over the next 10 years, and that's not a lot. I mean, the national debt is projected to go up by about $10 trillion over the next 10 years. So cutting $2 trillion from that would just be a small part of it, but it is a start, and so I mean, I think this does represent some progress.
And once again, are you hearing from rank and file members of Congress that, hey, this is our process and it's kind of been usurped, even members who voted for the legislation?
Yes, there's concern and there's criticism, that understood. But I mean, I expect this committee will do its work. This law will go forward, and we'll see what happens.
Have you found any loopholes that would allow this committee to increase spending?
No, I haven't seen any. Of course, I mean, there's always the possibility of loopholes and different ways of interpreting things, and I would be surprised if there were not some. But I don't see how the committee would increase spending. I mean, its mission is to reduce the deficit. You can do that by increasing revenues too, but it's going to be very hard to get a revenue increase through the House, even if the committee agrees on one, which also would be an uphill climb.
John Wonderlich, does the Sunlight Foundation take a position on whether or not this committee, let's say it doesn't come to agreement by November 24th, and the automatic cuts go into effect, or if the Congress votes down what the committee has decided?
So we wouldn't take a position on that. The only kind of work on budget spending that we've done was to, in the spring, appropriators proposed to cut 95% of the budget that pays for the website usaspending.gov, where we can track how the government is spending money. And so we sounded the alarm and started the Save the Data campaign to say if you're going to cut money, let's not cut the one program that lets us see where we're spending money, especially when it costs almost nothing. So we were able to stop that. But that's the only kind of spending that we are active on.
William is a Republican in Berea, Kentucky. Good morning, William.
Yes, how are you? I think that they should focus across the board. One thing, they need to raise taxes on the wealthy. The ones that got the offshore bank accounts and stuff, who got their offices offshore. I think they could use some welfare reforming. Like I heard that Florida was doing mandatory drug testing on welfare recipients, and also for the ones that who are 20 years old, who are SSI, who has never worked a day in their life. But I'm more partial to about the veterans. I do know that they have a $4.43 billion cut for their veterans involving health care and their benefits compensation. And I think that they need to leave the veterans alone, because we've sacrificed a lot for this country. And if it wasn't for the veterans, beginning with the Battle of Lexington and Concord, all up till now, which is Afghanistan, and we sacrificed a lot for this country. And if it wasn't for the veterans, we wouldn't have all these free enterprise and these big corporations making all their money.
All right, William, thank you for calling in. This comment from Gary. That's perfect. More congressional staff. How fitting when we are talking of getting our budget in order that Congress needs more staff. Last call on this topic of the super committee, and what's next? Virginia Beach, Virginia. David, Democrat.
Yes, good morning, and thanks for the call, C-SPAN. I just think we're in a paradigm shift with technology, and I kind of think they're tripping all over their shoestrings trying to run the country. And I can appreciate them wanting to have a 12-member, or if you want to call it a 12 disciple, but it's always one that just doesn't get it. Just back in the time during the Messiah's time, and they're going to crucify it. They're going to take him out. So I think they're in the dark. They're kicking the can, just trying to hear where the can is going to see what they need to do next. And but it's obvious we got an issue in this country. The banks are seeing the handwriting on the wall before the people are, and they're looting the treasury, and they're just running like crazy. And I think I'm in line with the gentleman here that I think he's John Wonderlich.
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
I hope I pronounced his name right.
Yeah, you got it.
The transparency will help tremendously, even if they're behind the closed doors. If there's a way to get a clear picture of where we are now, where we came from, and where we're trying to go. I've been trying to develop that tool for years, and running my own company, to be able to see where you are, where you're going, helps tremendously. And I think I would love to get with them. My company is Solid Builders. I'm going to probably try to get in touch with you, so listen out for my company. And I can show you how we can transparently put everything in order, real time, accountability, transparency, no fluff, no games, and make good decisions, because that's what it allows you to do.
Mr. Wonderlich.
Thank you very much for your comments. Look forward to it. I would say that everything we do as citizens, down to even the most basic thing of voting, it's only meaningful if we're able to vote based on what we understand. And if our leaders don't let us see what they're doing or who's proposing what, or if we can't understand what they're talking about, then voting becomes an almost meaningless act. So transparency is incredibly important.
Mr. Krozak, has congressional leadership left town as well, along with the rank and file?
Most of it has. I'm not sure if every congressional leader is gone, but certainly I think most of them are.
Do you think we'll hear any announcements before August 16th about who may be on the committee? Are they all going to wait and jockey and wait for the others and do a full announcement?
It's not clear. I've been talking with the leaders' offices, and it's not clear if they're all going to wait until they make their appointments and announce it together, or whether they will announce it individually, and it's not clear when they will. Mitch McConnell has said that he will make the announcement soon, but it's not clear what soon means. That could be days, it could be a week, it could be more than that. So we don't know yet.
Though.
By August 16th, right.
Okay. Our guests have been Paul Krozak with Congressional Quarterly and John Wonderlich with the Sunlight Foundation. Gentlemen, thank you very much. About an hour and a half left to go in the Washington Journal this morning. We're going to turn our attention next